All right, friends, we've got a lot to cover. We're going to keep it to an hour today, and I want to make sure that we get everything in. I've had such incredible feedback about last week's webinar. Folks really enjoyed it and are getting super excited for Lent, which is awesome. Lent has really captured the imaginations of our traditions. It really has become this crucible, even more powerfully, I think, than Advent, although Advent also does that. But it has become this crucible, this container for a more deeply spiritual journey than we take in the rest of the year. So I think that's why, in thinking about what I was going to do for this reboot, which is a shortened one to 2 weeks rather than our usual 6 weeks, because Lent is so early this year, when I was thinking about what are we going to do, I thought about these two basic principles. And last week, we talked about the first principle, which was deep structure. And we talked about why do we want to do worship series, all the great reasons to do that in terms of how we can go on a deeply spiritual journey. We talked about the fact that it's not antithetical to lectionary preaching. You can also follow the lectionary, but have a particular lens to look at the readings through for a season. It helps to distinguish this Lent season from last year's Lent season, etc. And we also talked about structure for design as being important, and not just for organizational purposes, but because when we structure a series, when we come up with an order of worship that follows the fourfold pattern, but maybe in a little different way than we normally do, because of what the message is, when we structure our worship around the message, then it takes on a very unique flavor. It takes on something unique that helps us to dive in deeper. So the structure for design is both organizational, but it also has to do with spiritual depth, with the ability for your congregation to be on a deeply meaningful journey. And then we talked some design terminology, and I took you through 3 very important design terms that I use to help me design worship, but that also translate into some practices that really help you as a designer, helps you as a worship team to streamline the process, to really get on board, to be on the same page, literally, but also that ultimately helps congregational participation deepen. And so we talked about writing synopses, right? We talked about writing these short little descriptions of the overarching message, but then also for every week, every service in the whole series, and we call those frames, right? We talked about anchor image, a strong metaphor, a strong symbol that can literally anchor us through the season and bring in some great participation from the congregation and something that's really memorable, right? So we talked about the power of symbols to make something that's so sometimes ineffable, I love that word, but so big in concept, and bring it into something tangible that is so memorable. And then finally, we talked about threads, and that is finding some things that repeat throughout the season. It might be musical punctuation. It could be things we start with, something around prayer, a benediction song. It can be some words can repeat. It can be visuals that repeat. It can be things that we use on the screen that repeat, but that threads throughout the season, in effect, give it a flavor. Or if you want to use marketing terminology, it would brand it, right? So it creates something unique for that time period that steeps us in the message. And all of this is based on the message. Form follows function, right? A function is to communicate the message really well. And our forms, all of our forms, are going to serve the message. So that was last week in a nutshell. And that recording, if you didn't get to watch it yet, that recording is available on my YouTube channel. And you also got links in your email to that recording. So what we did last week as well is we used 3 of my fully scripted Lent series as examples of all of these things. And we're going to continue to do that. So I want to remind you that you can find out more about each one of these three by going to worshipdesignstudio.com/gifts. That will lead you to more information about Gifts of the Dark Wood, a Lent series that is based on a book by the same name that really helps us to see ourselves, those times in our life when the path seems uncertain, we feel like we might have gotten lost, maybe we took a wrong turn in our life, those uncertain times, and seeing those not as things to be completely fearful of, but to see them as possibilities, and that there are gifts residing in those moments in our lives. And Lent is a perfect time to think about that kind of thing in our lives. Roll Down Justice is from last year, and oh my gosh, last weekend I got to be in Dallas teaching and leading worship at the Dallas chapter of the Choristers Guild. And Roll Down Justice is based on a book, songbook of Mark Miller's songs that Choristers Guild published. And so we got to do, Mark Miller and I got to co-lead 2 worship services pulled from that Lent series, and it was so amazing. I can't even tell you. If you're not my friend on Facebook, become my friend on Facebook, because I posted some pictures and some clips from that. And it was so wonderful because, friends, my job is kind of bizarre a little bit in that I design these series and I can see it in my head as I'm writing it, but sometimes I don't ever get to actually embody it and lead it. All of you are doing that. And so to actually get to lead a couple of the services from Roll Down Justice was amazing. It was so fabulous. And here's the thing. It looked exactly like it looked in my head when I designed it. So that was a lot of fun. But you can find out more about that one at worshipdesignstudio.com/rolldownjustice. And that is more of a focus on our baptismal rituals and how our baptism and the words we say at our baptism call us to be makers of justice, to bring more justice, love, hope, compassion into the world. So that is a great message for Lent, especially because Lent originated with as a season for preparation of catechumens for their baptism. People don't realize that. A lot of people don't realize that because in the Middle Ages, it really became a season that turned toward penitence. But that was not the origins of it. It was really preparation for baptism. And so if you want to take your community on a journey of looking at our baptismal rituals and then remembering their baptism in Holy Week, that is a really great one to do. And then, of course, the third one is the one I just designed called Listen. And it's after the colon, it's hearing that still small voice and finding your own. A much more contemplative kind of series. Very different feel for worship. And you can find out more about that at worshipdesignstudio.com/listen. And let me just say right now, before I forget, that those of you who are doing the Listen series, I'm going to do a Get Ready webinar like I do every season that I do these fully scripted series. A Get Ready webinar on January 30th, that's a Tuesday, at 10 a.m. Pacific, so this same time. So if you're doing Listen, be sure to put that on your calendar. We'll be sending out an email to remind you. But Chuck Bell, who wrote some of the music with me, is going to be on, and we are going to take you through everything, answer all your questions. So that is in 2 weeks on a Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, January 30th. So put that on your calendar. And I want to just remind you that last week I announced that if you want to get any one of these series a la carte, if you're not a Worship Design Studio member, remember, if you are a member, you get everything we do and have in the past and the future next year for free. So this week only a 20% or $20 discount on these series a la carte. So be sure that you do that. I'm going to keep it open. I'm going to keep that open until Friday midnight, and then that promo code will go away. Okay, friends. So let's get started on the second principle, spiritual depth. Now, spiritual depth, just like last week, some of our terminology and thinking about deep structure is also about spiritual depth. We're going to talk about some very nitty-gritty kind of technical things that have to do with spiritual depth. Because the more we're prepared, the more we've done our work beforehand, the more we as worship leaders get to actually worship during the act of worship. Hello. Right? And this is so vitally important because we are modeling the kind of presence, being in the moment, worshiping, that we want back from the congregation. If you are leading worship in a perfunctory kind of didactic way, we're kind of going through the checklist, it's not going to feel as deeply spiritual as it could if we do some things beforehand to really prepare ourselves to be immersed in this journey. So that's what we're about this second week, the second principle that, if there is anything you can do to raise the quality of your worship, it is to actually deepen the spiritual experience of it, to connect more deeply to God. And that's that's the role of worship anyway, right? To connect with God. For me, the mission of worship is to build up the body of Christ for its work in the world through encounter with the holy living God, right? We're building up the body. We're connecting to God so that we might have the strength, the compassion, the love, the grace that God bestows upon us so that we might bestow that upon the world and make the world a better place. That for me is the connection. And so we must treat worship as a spiritual journey and not just as a checklist of items that are obligatory as part of our religion, as part of our faith. So spiritual depth is so vitally important. As we go through, I sent you 3 documents. They are excerpts from my book, Think Like a Filmmaker. And the Think Like a Filmmaker concept comes out of my research of interviewing and asking filmmakers, how do you tell a story that just grips us? When we go to a really good movie, 2 hours can go by like that. If we go to a worship service that hasn't really had the kind of preparation that it needs, an hour can feel like forever, right? Our sense of time is completely different because filmmakers have immersed us in the story. And so I began to ask them, how is it that you keep us engaged? And I found out some incredible things that I'm going to share a little bit with you today. So threshold moments. I began to think about the beginning of worship as a threshold a long time ago. And as I talked to filmmakers, it was just, affirmed. This belief that we have to have a threshold moment was affirmed by my conversations with them. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. Transitions and flow. The way they keep us engaged is to make sure that we don't get what they call pulled out of the picture, right? So as soon as we become aware of the mechanics of something, we get distracted away from the story itself, then we get pulled out of the moment and we become onlookers rather than those who are in the midst of it participating, right? So transitions and flow are huge in maintaining spiritual depth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then what I call cue to cue rehearsals. This comes from my theater background, right? And this is the nitty gritty of how we pay attention to all the little details so that in the moment of worship, we get to feel confident that we have dealt with the details, that we can actually worship in the moment, be fully present in the moment, instead of constantly thinking ahead of ourselves. Did I remember that? Oh my gosh, is so-and-so going to do, right? That's not a great place to be in the midst of worshiping, right? So all of this has to do with spiritual practices that we do for ourselves that help to prepare us to be spiritually centered. All of these things, this is like, I'm going to do this in 45 minutes now, right? But if you want to spend much longer on it, just want to let you know that we only have a few spots left for our Elevation Worship, Design, and Leadership Retreat in Tahoe, at Lake Tahoe. Yes, this is a picture from the conference center. That's what we look out on from the room where you're going to be doing your sessions. And there's only a few spots left. So want to make sure that everybody on this reboot, on this journey to Lent reboot, knows about that. Okay, deepen and heighten your skills, deepen your spiritual journey. Woohoo! It's a great, great thing. Okay, so threshold moments, my friends. So A threshold moment is a moment where we leave behind our normal everyday rhythm of life. So just think about what you do on, when you get up on, let's say, a Sunday morning, if that's when your worship is, and all of the steps that have to happen before you get to church, and then all the things that you do in preparation once you get there. Now, if you're a worship leader, that's going to be pretty intense. For people who are just coming to church, they still have a rhythm of life. Getting the kids ready, or if they don't have kids, getting themselves up, taking a shower, just, stuff you do every day, right? And then getting in the car, navigating traffic, all that stuff. You get down, you get in the parking lot, you come in, finally there, right? Now, I think a welcome and getting announcements is very, very important. But after that, there has to be a moment at which we cross a threshold, right? In ritual studies, one of the things that ritual theorists began to notice about rituals is that there was always a moment at which you left the ordinary everyday and went into a special kind of time, right? We call it kairos time, where time kind of stands still because we're enveloped, immersed in a different kind of feel. That's what we want for our worship. So if we do our welcome and our announcements, and then we say, and now let us stand and do our call to worship, it still feels kind of like we're going through the checklist. So I began to ask myself, how can we create the beginning of worship that takes us across a threshold into a different feel, into a different sense of being present, a different sense of time? How can we do that? Well, most often, music helps us do that. All right, so the introit is something that is a very traditional kind of thing, but I am taking the introit and the typical quote unquote call to worship, and I am exploding that into something that is an experience of the introduction of the direction for the Sunday. Now, I want to direct your attention for Gifts of the Dark Wood, one of our Lent series that we're using as examples. If you go to that page that tells more about it, worshipdesignstudio.com/gifts, and scroll down just a little bit, there is a video. And in that video, you're going to hear what I call the threshold song, the thread song, the theme song, right, for that series called There's a Path. And then you're going to hear me do the threshold moment. And the sequence is kind of like, you'll hear the introduction to the song. You'll hear me do the synopsis that we talked about last week, right? So that's one of those uses for a synopsis, is actually to use that in the threshold moment. And what that does is it lets people know immediately at the beginning of worship, what is the spiritual path that we're on? What is the theme? What is the trajectory? One of the reasons why I don't use sermon series as terminology for a series, but I call it worship series, I think I mentioned this last time, and it's really important to me, is because too often I have been to a church, visiting a church, and there's call to worship, there's hymn, there's prayers, there's children's time, whatever, scripture, and then the preacher says, at the beginning of the sermon, we're doing a sermon series on blah, 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 blah. And I go, wow, I wish I had known that like 15 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, because the choice of the hymn would have made much more sense. And I would have been able to really enter into that hymn through that lens of the series. But I didn't know, because there was nothing that helped me to know that in a specific way until we got to the sermon. So I really want you to practice and begin to use worship series and know that that starts right at the get-go of worship, right? Helping folks to enter into that journey. So the threshold moment and using that synopsis in that threshold moment helps us to see where we're going. And when we see where we're going, you see the brain does this really amazing thing, is that if we have a framework, right? The threshold moment creates a framework for experiencing all the things that come after that, then our brain goes, aha, oh, ooh, I see. Oh, wow. And our brain loves that. Our brain loves to make those connections. And that helps us participate more fully. It helps us really get into it more deeply through our heart and our head. So you'll see as you play that video, you will hear that theme song. You will hear me do the synopsis. You will hear that music continue on, and then you'll hear a short prayer. And that's all from the script. That is all from the threshold moment. Now, in that article that we sent you in preparation for today, you can see it right there laid out. You can read it along the way. But I wanted you also to be able to hear it. So go to that after this webinar. Go and listen to that threshold moment, because it will help you understand what we're talking about. Then what you'll do is, if you're looking at that threshold moment and looking at the script of it, you will see kind of what we're saying. Someone enters, maybe bringing the light in a lantern instead of a acolyte stick this series, because it's like going through the woods, through a path, and trying to find our way. And a lantern is more a representation or an interpretation of the light in the midst of finding your way on a path than an acolyte stick, right? It adds to the message to use that. So I want you to do that when you get off the webinar, or if you're watching this recording, just pause it. Go listen to it, look at the script next to it from that article, and get an idea of what I mean by this threshold moment. So let me just talk about the threshold moment for listen, because it's a little bit different than what I just described in terms of starting with welcome and announcements. Now, almost always, I will say, do a welcome, do your announcements, because that's a very different kind of voice, right? And then do your threshold moment that gets you into the ritual. But on a theme where listen is the is the lens, hearing a still small voice, I wanted to create something that would wake us up to this, that would really help us to see things in a different way. And so this is an experiment. And if you're doing listen and you think that, oh, my folks, this would really be difficult to make happen in our church, you can adapt it. But here's an idea. And that is to encourage people to have their conversations, their hellos, everything in the narthex before they enter the sanctuary, or the halls, or wherever your gathering place is. And on the doors of the sanctuary, keep them closed, have ushers just let people in, but have a sign either on the door or before the door, maybe is even better, and train the ushers to simply say, for this season of Lent, we're entering in quiet. So, and that's all I need to say, and hand them the bulletin, right? Don't have to go into deep detail. But imagine entering into the sanctuary. Have you ever gone into the sanctuary all by yourself? I love being in sanctuaries by myself. I love sitting there in the quiet, feeling the space, feeling the memory of the people in the space, the anticipation of people who will be in the space. There's something mystical about being in the sanctuary, and I kind of want to create that for this series. So invite people to come in silence and sit. And either if you have a musician who likes to play a lot and would play for 10, 15 minutes beforehand, that's fine. But also think about soundtracks, digital soundtracks that would just keep this kind of like the music I was playing as you all came on to the webinar. I think it's a Pandora station that's like spa music or something. I think it's called contemplative piano solos or something like that. Or nature sounds, or things that would be very calming, right? Now, what it means, friends, and this is a discipline as well, talk about a Lent discipline. It means that all of your prep for worship has to be finished by the time you open the doors to people, which needs to be probably 10 minutes before at least. So it means that you're going to have to maybe get people there earlier to get all your preparation done so that they can clear the space and there's not people walking around and distracting or making noise or practicing. And that would be a great gift just for this season to try that on for size. And you know what? Here's the thing. It may even be something that then you can continue, not that you continue that silence at the beginning after Lent, but that working a little bit further ahead will keep you from having mass chaos in the sanctuary up until right when the service starts. Come on, admit it. I know some of that, it happens, right? It happens. And sometimes you can't avoid it. But if you can back up your rehearsing, your sound checking, your all that stuff a little bit so that you have some before the service, that's good for everybody, leaders and people alike. Okay, so in this listen threshold moment, we're talking about coming into some sound effects, some music, quiet. And I call it music for settling, right? So I love to call things what they are. So in the worship guide, it would say music for settling. Hopefully a cue to people that they should just settle. And then something called evoking the mystery is what I'm calling the threshold moment. Now imagine we've gotten to this point, and at start time, the soundtrack or music goes down into silence for just a few seconds, and then singing bowls. You know those singing bowls? You can use handbells like that too with a wooden stick around the edge of them. Ooh, it does that. Maybe there's a rain stick, and maybe that's surround sound. So people are surrounding the congregation. Maybe you have a balcony that you can do that from. Then maybe there's a rain stick that happens over here and some chimes that happen over here, right? So we're creating this very mystical, mysterious kind of feel, almost like you're in a backyard garden and there's some wind blowing the chimes, right? So evoking the mystery. And in the midst of that, we let that go for a little bit. And then the leader stands up and says, I invite you to stand and turn and face the light as it comes into our midst, right? And so that's when the acolyte would come forward just with all that soundtrack going on, right? So mystical hush soundtrack kind of going on. Then as that light comes forward, the leader has something to say. It is this turning or reorienting ourselves toward the holy that will characterize our season of Lent. What we pay attention to is what we are formed by. So you see, what I'm doing here has to do with spiritual leadership, right? Deeply spiritual leadership. I'm not just saying stand and turn and face the light. Done. I'm giving you a theological reason why we're doing that for this season, right? And what that helps is for people who are going, why are we doing this new thing? What do I know you don't have any of those people at your church. It gives them a reason why, but it also helps us go deeper into doing that, right? It helps us right away. We're being led into that spiritual path. So when the candles get lit, that's when the theme song begins to go. Come and rest, come and listen. Lay the fullness of our lives before the Maker. And then you have that synopsis, right? So the synopsis for this Sunday in the Lent series, Listen, says sometimes we just need to get away in order to hear from that still small voice within. This quiet voice is an attribute of the holy living God, as Elijah found out when he retreated to a cave where he expected to experience God in big wind and earthquake and fire. What is your cave? What place? Perhaps a park, a path, a rocking chair, a shoreline. What practice? Walking, journaling, reading, making art. What helps you get to the depths of your life and get quiet long enough to hear that still small voice, right? So you see how right away at the beginning of worship, I, as a worship leader, as a spiritual leader, pastor, worship leader, whoever it is that is best suited to do this, is inviting people to the essence of the message. Now, this does not mean, that you're going to give the whole sermon at this point. It simply is inviting you to an anticipation of what through the whole service is going to get unpacked, right? So that is, and then you see in that we go back into a repeat of that theme song, and the theme song goes into silence in this threshold moment. So you can see that in the listen, in the document that we gave you around the threshold moment in Listen. And also, if you're going to do Listen, I want to encourage you to come on to the Get Ready webinar in a couple of weeks, January 30th at 10 o'clock Pacific, because I'm going to do kind of what I just did, only I'm going to go through the whole service with you so you can really get prepared for how to lead that. Okay, so threshold moment. Are you getting the idea of this? Jenna, what kind of questions do we have going on? Comments thus far?
Yep, we have 2 questions so far about threshold moments.
All right.
Peggy asked, do you think that a well-designed threshold moment might eventually cut down on folks entering the service late?
Yes!
Saying it would be encouraged to come on in.
Yes, absolutely. We train our people to come in late by having too many announcements, by not getting into the worship. So, as we think about threshold moment, as well as developing that, I'm going to suggest that you really evaluate your announcement time and make sure that that's not going on too long. If you go to marciamcfee.com and go to my blog and then search for the word announcements, I have a blog about my opinions about announcements, and I have a form. I have a 3-step, it's called a 3-sentence story, and shows you sort of how to discern how to make your announcements more effective and shorter. And so it's a both and, right? But absolutely, if something amazing happens at the beginning of service, word is going to get out and people are going to start showing up on time. Awesome question. Jenna, what's next?
Another question to kind of go along with this one. Deb says, we have no space for gathering before, just the sanctuary.
Yeah.
But what about visitors, like you talked about earlier, people who don't understand what all this means?
Yeah.
I'm concerned with them not being greeted or understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
Kathleen actually just sent us a comment. Deb, our church is also small without a narthex. I print the threshold moment out so they can understand what the worship will be as they sit.
Nice. Yeah, I love that, we get to share wisdom on these webinars. It's awesome because people have experience with these things, especially if you've been studying with me for a while. So so we're not going to cut out greeting people, right? But it's going to put more responsibility on the greeters to actually greet. If they don't recognize the person, are you a visitor? We're so glad that you're here. Want you to know that we're doing something special for Lent, for this 6 weeks. They may not know what Lent is, right? And maybe you have a little explanation, what a great idea, in your worship guide about how this is a little bit different, that we're going to get to. So in the Listen series, we're going to get to welcome and announcements later on in the service, which is unusual for me, but I think that it helps the message, right? Form follows function. So maybe even just a little thing to say, but train your greeters and maybe leaders, since you're already ready in the sanctuary, maybe part of what your job is to be in the gathering area and greeting people out there, so that they get that same thing that's happening when you do the greeting from in the worship. So the thing about not having a narthex, everybody's going to have to adapt according to their space, according to their context. I create these things and then I expect that you're going to adapt it. And what I would say is to let people know that at, say, 5 minutes till, we're going to go into a music for settling, right? And so at that point, put a note on the door that to enter in quiet, enter in silence, what have you. But people will get used to that rhythm because in a series, we talked about this last week, one of the beautiful things of a series is that it may be new the first week, but people will get into it. And here's what I also know about silence is that we don't do it very well as North Americans. But once we realize that there's a pattern to it and we get used to that, people will crave more and more of it. So give it time. Don't think that your experience the first Sunday is going to be exactly how it is every Sunday because people will get used to the rhythm. Okay, Jenna, what else?
A question from Annie. What if we really need to do announcements first?
We really do. Okay, well, that's fine. You must have a good reason for that. I would say that you do your announcements and then you say, during the season of Lent, we're focusing on the still small voice of God, a characteristic of God that is one of the most important things to remember, that we have to get quiet sometimes in order to hear that nudge from God, to feel that nudge from God. So I invite you to a deep breath. Take another deep breath. And you see right away, what you are doing is you are slowing the rhythm of the room with that, with the rhythm of your breathing. And it will slow people down so that you can get to that place. Okay? So, awesome. Anything else, Jenna, before I move on to the next thing?
One comment I want to share from Alexis. If I'm understanding correctly, there are ways to turn directions that people need to hear, for example, the hymn title, by changing the reading from now we're going to sing hymn number blank to using a theological reason for why we're doing it, such as let us celebrate the gift of love by singing hymn number blank.
Yes, exactly. That's right. That's right. And that's a wonderful segue to what we're going to talk about next. Thank you so much. Okay, so next we're going to talk about verbal transitions and musical transitions. Woot, woot. Flow and transitions. I am known as the flow queen by people who work with me because I am so adamant that we pay attention to how we are getting into and out of things. I had, my first career was in professional dance, and I had a wonderful mentor teacher say to me, Marcia, people who can do a quadruple pirouette come a dime a dozen. But a real artist is somebody who knows how to get out of that quadruple pirouette into the next thing, right? Because it is that, how are we moving from one thing to the next? Now, let me go back to think like a filmmaker in my research with filmmakers. As I was talking to editors, studying the editing process, that kind of thing, one thing that was really strongly put is that if you become aware of the scene change, then it is, it's kind of like that, it's like when you're looking at something on the screen and it's a meditative moment, let's say, you've got projection technology, it's a meditative moment, and then let's say the slide forwards at a time it's not supposed to, and everybody goes like this, right? So it's really important, these transitions, to help us move from one thing to the next and to feel like worship is that journey. Now, it's not always that we need an audible. There might be some where silence is what we need in between pieces. But there's a big difference between intentional silence and awkward silence, right? So we want to plan for the times when there's silence. So verbal transitions, we have to discern. Do we need a verbal transition? Do we need a musical transition? Do we need both at the same time? And so let's take a look at an example of these verbal and musical transitions to get the idea here. So I'm drawing now on the slide from the Roll Down Justice series. Okay, so this is the scripture reading section of a Sunday from that series, and I call it a word for humanity, right? So you'll notice if you do more than one of my series that I like to find ways to label a section something that helps us see it in a different way. So word from humanity, i.e. the scripture section. And I called it that. I didn't call it scripture, especially because it was always a scripture plus a poem from our guest poet laureate for this series, Bishop Luttrell Miller Easterling. So the word was coming an ancient word and a contemporary word. So the whole section is called A Word for Humanity. Okay, now you'll see in the rubrics, that's the red, it says the accompaniment to the feature song for this week. Remember, this series is based on the songs of Mark Miller from a collection. And every Sunday, I have a feature song. So it says the accompaniment to the feature song for this week plays with the children going out or going back to their seats. So right away, I'm saying we need some way to get to keep our energy in this prayerful, worshipful space as the children go, instead of just clompity clomp, 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 right? So I'm a big fan, especially if children are moving or anybody, choirs are moving. Whenever we have big movement and we need for people to get from one place to the other, a simple underscore, musical underscore, I call it walking music, can do wonders to keep us in the worshipful mood. So that's what I'm suggesting here. And then there's an introduction of the song. So the introduction says this: over half of the liturgical songs of the Israelites were psalms of lament. Over half of our psalms are psalms of lament. Penned in a time of exile and persecution, these were poets trying to give voice to the pain of the people. Today we lament the injustice of our time, and yet we also remember that even and especially in times of despair, through our baptism we are given the freedom and power to resist evil in all its forms and to put our whole trust in God. So that's the main message for the whole Sunday, is that part of our baptismal ritual, right? So I want us to see this lament, this tradition of lament, and we're about to sing a song of lament called How Long, based on Psalm 13. And so I'm giving people kind of a way to enter into that more deeply, instead of just singing the words. How will we put these words into action to show hope to the world? Now, as I'm saying that, the accompaniment is going underneath, right? Because the children use the accompaniment, children have gone back or out or whatever they do. And then as I'm saying that, the music is going, especially because this is a new song for the congregation, right? All these feature songs are new songs, probably for most of our congregations. And then we begin singing, right? Now, what we're not going to get to do in this shortened 2-week reboot that we usually do in the 6-week reboot is talk about song leading and how to most successfully introduce a new song. But really quickly, always hearing it first and then singing it. So a soloist or a choir singing the first verse, then bringing the congregation, all that good stuff. Okay. So then we go into the song. So do you see how the verbal and musical transition kept us in the story, also served to deepen our experience of this new song that we're about to sing? So we sing a verse of it, then it says continue instrumental underscore, and we go into the scripture, the psalm. So the psalm reader is reading. Now, one of the reasons why the psalms are a great chance to play with underscoring, playing underneath, is because they are poetry, right? The Psalms are poetry, and you can read it with pauses to let the music that's going underneath. Now, here's what I want you to do. You know what? And Jenna, you're going to help me remember this. When I send out the recording, I'm also going to send a link to Chuck Bell and I doing an example of a psalm with music underneath, so you can see how that works. All right, because I think it's a really great video where we do it and we analyze what we're doing, and we talk about it, and it's a wonderful one to watch musicians and pastors, worship leaders together. So I'll put that link in the email with the recording. All right, so then we sing another verse of the song. So you see how the song is being woven into the scripture reading. And then we come to a conclusion before we hear the prayer poem. Now, one of the things that is important to remember is, as powerful as music is underneath reading, if we do that all the time, it becomes as monotonous as never doing it, right? So I suggest music underneath the psalm, but then not underneath the poem, because the poem by Bishop Easterling is so rich that we really want to let the words be the main thing, right? So there's times to choose to underscore and times to choose not to underscore. So the poem continues, and when the poem ends, you come in and just sing a little tag, the refrain of that song. So that thing has woven itself through, and you'll see that after the sermon ends with that same little tag, because the song itself is part of the proclamation, right, in this series. Series can have many, many different inspirational starting points, and my starting point for this series were these songs. And so I want people to feel and experience that feature song as part of the proclamation. But you can see how the verbal transition, the musical transition worked there. All right, so let's stop there. And Jenna, are there any questions about this verbal transition, musical transition? Again, if you haven't read the articles that we sent, the article about it that we sent with the webinar announcement for today, it's an actual excerpt from my book. So you may get a lot more in there than I'm able to have time to do today. Anything, Jenna?
I don't see any other content questions yet.
Okay, great. All right, so let's go on to our third point for this morning, for this webinar, and that is the cue to cue rehearsal. Okay, a cue to cue rehearsal from my theater days. Now, a cue to cue rehearsal is not a dress rehearsal per se, because you're not actually doing the whole thing without stopping. You are actually going through the entire script. Remember, we're going to write scripts for leaders that have all these rubrics and everything. So just like what you've been seeing on these slides, that's what I want leaders to have. I don't want them to have a bulletin. I want them to have that very detailed kind of thing. And you'll get used to doing scripts. And when you do, you'll think, how did I live without them? It makes our worship so much smoother. But you go through the scripts with your main leaders. So you don't have to have your readers there for the cue to cue, right? But you do need to have whoever is going to give the reader their instructions on Sunday morning before the service, right? So their instruction may be, and they'll have a script that will say, go to the podium as we sing this verse of the song, right? Or whatever, wherever they're reading from. But someone who is going to give the instructions to them would need to be at the cue to cue. So in other words, you don't need everybody there. That just creates a whole lot more work in getting people there and scheduling and blah, blah, blah. So it's main leaders. It is not Sunday morning. It's before Sunday morning. All right. So when you're designing, and I talked about this last week, when you're designing, you are creating scripts for the entire series in one fell swoop, right? In production week, which is a month before the series begins. And when you have all those scripts, then you know what's going to happen. When we talked about threads, there are things that are going to repeat. So your first week cue to cue is going to be more intense than the other week's cue to cue, right? So you already have your scripts made. So you're going to do this. I always suggest you do a cue to cue before, like if you have choir practice or band practice on Wednesday nights, let's say, that's a common thing. Do it before then. Because if there are things that you need to tell the choir, like maybe you're going to decide that the choir is going to surround the congregation at the beginning of listen, that they're going to actually be sitting on the ends of the aisles on the outside for that time of silence and meditation. And then they stand up right where they are when it's time to sing. And then maybe they process forward during the opening hymn. Whatever you've decided, right, about their movement. You need to be able to tell them that before Sunday morning, because you know it always creates anxiety to give them something new. Now they're going to repeat it every week, so it's not like you're recreating the wheel every week. But that first week, you're going to want to get together, major leadership, answer these questions about where people are, what do we need, getting all our ducks in a row, so that you can tell people at their rehearsal. So that's just an example of when you would do that cue to cue. Now, I'm also suggesting that you do a cue to cue every week, but it's not going to be, like I said, as intense after you do that first Sunday, because you're going to have those things that repeat, those thread items. And that's another great reason why we do worship series. Okay, so let's go through these questions. Leader-reader placement. Where are leaders sitting when the worship begins? When are they in their places? Where will they lead from? When do they move into and out of the position to lead? What microphones do they use? Making sure that those sound people have a script that says who's speaking, from where, with what microphone. That sets them up for success rather than just watching, right? Because we all know what happens when they just watch, they miss some things. Do they carry their script with them, or is it in place somewhere already? So you see how I'm getting kind of some nitty-gritty things that if you answer all these questions and you have that all prepared, Oh, you stop worrying about that in the midst of worship. Okay, so let's look at musicians. When do they need to be in their places at their instruments? Where do they sit when not playing or singing? And when do they make their transitions to keep the flow going? Right? So you're going to go through, as you go through the whole service, you're going to say, yeah, we need some musical with some walking music because the choir who sits in the congregation needs to get to their places, and we want to do that without just watching them go. We don't want people to just be distracted by the mechanics. We're going to keep them in the story by keep having a little bit of music going. So you go through all those transitions. Where do we need flow? Are there readings under which music is playing? Do they have their cues? And I always run through anything that involves more than one medium at a time. So in other words, you'll want to have, if there's a reader who's going to read over with a piano or a guitar playing, you want that reader to come early enough on Sunday morning that the two of them can run through that, especially if they've never done that before, because that's a different way of reading. All right. And again, that link to the piece of Chuck and I talking about this whole underscoring will help you with that. Do you have a backup plan if ritual actions with music take longer or shorter than expected, right? So communion or lighting candles, or for the Listen series, the prayer stations, all of that thing. Do you have a plan? What's the backup plan? Because there's nothing worse than just, oh, we got to the end of our music and stop. Or equally, if we want musicians to take communion, how are we going to do that? Before, at the beginning, at the end of communion? Do we have somebody who's a musician who could take it at the beginning while the other musicians keep it going, so that they can then keep the music going as the rest of the musicians take communion toward the end of communion, right? This is all about flow, keeping us in the story. All right. How do we make transitions smooth? When do we begin musical introductions? When do we underscore? When is silence the best choice, with no verbal transition and no musical transition? These are all things we ask ourselves. And you'll see modeled in my full scripts that I suggest that kind of thing. Now, of course, you're going to have to tweak for your particular setting. Do we have a clear directive about tempos and feel for music? Think through all transitions. They are crucial elements in flow. What energy is happening and where do we need to go? Do we need to build the energy? Do we need to decrescendo into a more meditative space? That kind of thing. Don't assume that if you're a pastor who's chosen a hymn, don't assume that the musician has the kind of feel in mind that you do, right? Because you can get surprised sometimes that you thought, oh, let's do that one because it's an up-tempo thing, and then you find out, oh, your musician had a completely different idea of what tempo that song should be in, and it completely goes against why you chose it, or vice versa, right? Okay, visuals. Is the visual environment in place? Is anything in the way of needed space for movement, right? So if you have people going to prayer stations, do you have something in the middle of the aisle, or do you have something in a corner that's going to restrict good movement? Look at your space. Think about the traffic patterns. Is everything, if we have a string quartet, do we know that? And do the people who are creating the procession of the light forward, maybe they have something special planned, and all of a sudden the music director didn't let you know that you're going to have like a cello in the way. It's happened, believe me. Everything has happened to me in 25 years of doing this. It's happened to you, I'm sure. So talk about everything, right? Is something planned to happen with the tangible visuals during the service? How does it happen? How is it explained? What is the timing? What are the cues? Who's doing it? Do they know what to do? Thinking about instructions ahead of time is so important. I write out all of my instructions. I do not improvise instructions because I want to say exactly what will make it clear, and people will be confident in what they're about to do. But don't say too much, because when you say too much, then anxiety also raises. Okay, so I always write out my instructions and make sure I've said everything and only what I need to say. Are all ritual objects in place, communion elements, special objects, etc.? Okay, So, media. Um, do personnel at the computer running media have marked scripts? Are all the needed media projections there? You want to go through them all. Are all the words to the songs and the hymns correct? Okay, and this is part of the job of the music director. You need to have a musician check the slides, not just a tech person check the slides. You need to have somebody who knows the song to check the slides to make sure the line breaks are in the right place. When do the media images change? What is the timing? Does anything distract rather than support? Are there media images with sound from the computer? And have you checked it? Hello. Doesn't matter if last Sunday you ran something that had sound and it worked fine. There are gremlins, and you always check every little aspect before the service. Are all microphones working? Are they marked? Are they in place? Do they have fresh batteries if they need fresh batteries? Do readers know how to operate them? Do readers know if they have to turn something on or not? Do they know not to touch it if they don't need to touch it? Do the personnel at the soundboard have scripts marked with microphone needs and timing? I mentioned that before. Are there lighting changes in the service? Are they marked in the script? What's the timing and the rate of the speed of the change? I know this is like nitpicky, right? So what does this have to do with deeply spiritual worship? It has everything to do with it, because when you go through all of these things, then nothing distracts. You have less chance of things messing up. And it's not so that we can be perfect, my friends, or slick. It's so that we can be deeply into the worship and be there and fully reside there. And that there are the least things distracting us from the main thing. That's what it's all about, not about being slick. And all of these things, even if you don't have media, my friends, even if you're a small church and you have one microphone, all of these things apply, right? You're going to adapt it according to what you have and don't have. But this level of detail of questions is the level of detail that I want you to pay attention to, no matter the size of your church, because it will pay off. It will really pay off. Okay, so the last one is ritual action, drama. Are there things that the congregation need when they arrive? So, like for instance, in the Listen series, we have the booklets. In the Roll Down Justice series, we have the strips of cloth that people are going to write on. In Gifts of the Dark Wood, there are different prayer stations where you go to. So we have to think about, do we have everything in place? Do ushers know that they need to give out a blue strip as well as a worship guide? That kind of thing. Do we have people who can facilitate that? Are there special movements of the congregation to stations for prayer, for candlelighting, for communion? Do the ushers know exactly how to help the flow of traffic? All of these kinds of things. Jenna, any questions before we sign off?
Yes, here's a question from Alexis. Do you have suggestions on how to use recordings when live music isn't possible in a way that enhances the worship experience? Recordings would be really helpful at times, but they can also seem abrupt and feel like something outside of what is happening rather than an organic part of the service.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know whether you're talking about recordings of music that you would sing along with, or recorded accompaniment, or recordings of various things. I think one of the most important things is to practice turning it on and to make sure that you, if the sound level is abrupt, that you practice maybe starting at a lower level and bringing it up to the level you want it. That helps ease it in a little bit. Same way that you would do that with an actual instrument in the space. And of course, making sure that you have it ready to go as soon as it's time for it, because the lag and that kind of thing can really take away. Those are things that I think about when I use recordings. Now, if you are using projected media, I put all of my sound files in the actual slide program. So when I go to the next slide, it's already in there, and I've already adapted it so that it slowly comes up and slowly goes out. It's just as much as I need. So in other words, sometimes you might have a recording that's actually too long, and what you don't want to do is cut it off in the middle, like right? So there are There are programs, editing programs, where you can just put it in and create those in and out for exactly the amount of time that you want. And that's really important. So if you're using recordings, these are not difficult programs. Somebody, if you don't know how to do that, somebody will know how to do that, because these are common programs these days. So those are the things that I can suggest about that. Anything else, Jenna?
That's all I have for now.
Great. Well, friends, all of these things add up to spiritual practices for us as leaders, so that we can be centered, that we can lead worship and worship at the same time, because that's really when we get to feel, and the people sense, that we're all on a journey together. Again, I want to remind you that Friday through Midnight Friday, we'll have the promo code DEEP. It's case sensitive. You can get 20% off if you're just buying one of these series a la carte. As you check out, you will have a chance to upgrade for $199. This is the most we give off ever on the Worship Design Studio for a year. You can add that to your purchase, your $79 purchase of one of the a la carte, and end up with all of our series. So you could potentially have fully scripted series for the next 3 years of Lent, and the next, well, I keep doing them. So as you get everything that we do this whole year and what we have in the past. So it just, it's, now's the time to do that if you want to do more than just one. But you can also just try one if you're not familiar with our series. Friends, thank you so much for being on this shortened 2-week journey to Lent, this Reboot Your Worship. I hope that you have learned some things that will make you excited for Lent, that will help you to just raise your level of the way you do worship, so that you might deepen your spiritual journey. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.